At around 1 in the morning on Christmas Day 1945, Jenny Sodder woke up to find her house on fire. She and her husband George escaped with 4 of their children. The other 5 never came out. When the fire was finally extinguished, investigators searched the rubble for remains. They found nothing, not a bone, not a tooth, not a fragment of anything that suggested 5 children had been inside that house. And that absence, that complete and total absence of evidence, is what turned a house fire into one of the most haunting unsolved mysteries in American history. But in any case, to understand why that absence mattered so much, we need to go back a little. George and Jenny Sodder were Italian immigrants who had built a quiet and respectable life in Fayetteville, West Virginia. George had come over from Sardinia in 1908 at the age of 13, found work on the Pennsylvania railroads, and eventually built his own coal trucking business from nothing. By 1945, the family was well established and well liked in the community. They had 10 children in total, ranging from toddlers to young adults. The oldest son, Joe, was away serving in the military at the time. That left 9 children in the house on Christmas Eve. George was known around town as a man with strong opinions and no particular reluctance to share them. In the months before the war ended, he had been publicly and repeatedly critical of the Italian dictator Benito Mussolini, which had not gone over well with some members of Fayetteville's Italian immigrant community, many of whom still admired him. This detail would come to matter later. On the evening of December 24th, 1945, the family celebrated Christmas at home. The younger children were excited about their gifts and asked their mother if they could stay up past their usual bedtime. Jenny agreed, on the condition that the 2 oldest boys still awake would remember to put the cows in and feed the chickens before going to bed. She then took the youngest child upstairs and went to sleep. The 5 children who stayed up that night were Maurice, who was 14, Martha, who was 12, Louis, who was 9, Jenny, who was 8, and little Betty, who was just 5 years old. It was the last time anyone who loved them would see them alive. Or at least, that is what the authorities would. Shortly after midnight, Jenny was woken by the phone ringing. The woman on the other end asked for someone she didn't recognize, laughed oddly when Jenny told her she had the wrong number, and then hung up. Jenny noticed that the lights downstairs were still on, and the front door was unlocked, things her children always took care of before going to bed. She assumed they were still awake and thought nothing more of it. She went back to sleep. At around 1 in the morning, she woke again, this time to the smell of smoke. The roof of the house was on fire. What happened in the next few minutes was chaotic and desperate. George woke up and immediately tried to reach the upstairs rooms where the 5 younger children were sleeping. He broke a window and attempted to climb the exterior wall of the house to reach them, but couldn't get a grip. He ran to the side of the house, where he always kept a ladder for emergencies. The ladder was gone. He tried to use the water pump to douse the flames. It wouldn't work. He attempted to move his truck close enough to use it to climb up to the second-floor windows. The truck wouldn't start, despite having worked perfectly the day before. Meanwhile, Jenny tried to call the fire department. The phone line was dead. By the time the fire department arrived, the house had burned to the ground. It had taken 45 minutes. George and Jenny escaped with 4 of their children. Marion, the oldest daughter, had been sleeping downstairs and got out. John and George Jr., the 2 older boys, made it out. And little Sylvia, the youngest, had been sleeping in Jenny's room and escaped with her mother. The 5 who had stayed up late that Christmas Eve never came out. When the fire was finally out, and investigators picked through what remained of the house, they found something that stopped everyone cold. There were no remains. Not a single bone, not a tooth, not one fragment of anything that suggested 5 children had been inside that building when it burned. This was not a small detail. If you know anything about how fires work, you'll understand immediately why this mattered. A house fire, even an intense one, does not fully destroy a human body. Bones survive. Teeth survive. Investigators routinely recover skeletal remains from even the most severe residential fires. Jenny later contacted a crematorium and asked how long and at what temperature a human body needed to be exposed to fire before the bones were completely destroyed. She was told it required at least 2 hours, at temperatures far exceeding anything a house fire could produce. The Sodder house had burned for 45 minutes. The fire chief ruled the deaths accidental and the cause as faulty wiring. He told the family the children's bodies had been completely incinerated and that there was nothing left to find. George and Jenny did not believe him, and as the days passed and they began to piece together everything that had happened that night, the list of things that didn't add up kept growing. The ladder that was always kept beside the house had been found the next morning discarded in a ditch some distance away. The water pump that George couldn't get to work had functioned perfectly before and after that night. The phone line had not been damaged by the fire. It had been deliberately cut. And the truck that wouldn't start had no mechanical explanation for why it failed that one time. Taken individually, any one of these details might have been a coincidence. Together, they pointed towards something far more deliberate than a house fire. But in any case, the family's suspicion that the fire had been deliberate didn't come from nowhere. Because in the months leading up to Christmas Eve, 2 separate strangers had shown up at the Sodder property with warnings that in hindsight were difficult to dismiss as coincidence. The first came in October of 1945. A life insurance salesman arrived at the house and attempted to sell George a policy. George turned him away. As the man left, he told George that his house would go up in smoke and that his children would be destroyed, citing specifically George's public criticism of Mussolini as the reason. George reported the threat, but nothing came of it. The second stranger appeared sometime before the fire and wandered around to the back of the house, uninvited. He pointed at the fuse boxes on the exterior wall and told George casually that the wiring was going to cause a fire someday. George had just had the wiring inspected by the local power company, which had pronounced it in perfectly good condition. When the family later hired a private investigator named C.C. Tinsley to look into the case, he uncovered something that made the insurance salesman's threat considerably more sinister. The man who had warned George that his house would go up in smoke had been a member of the coroner's jury that ruled the children's deaths accidental. He had also, without George and Jenny's knowledge or consent, increased the value of their home insurance policy in the weeks before the fire. Tinsley also discovered something else. The fire chief, who had insisted there were no remains to be found, had apparently told someone privately that he had discovered a human heart in the rubble. Rather than reporting this to the family, he had placed it inside a dynamite box and buried it at the scene. When the Sodders demanded he show them where, they dug it up and took it to a funeral director. The funeral director examined it and concluded it was not a human heart at all. It was a piece of beef liver that had never been exposed to fire. And then there were the sightings. In the days immediately following the fire, multiple people came forward with accounts that the family found impossible to ignore. A woman who lived nearby claimed she had watched the house burning from her window in the early hours of Christmas morning and had seen a car slow down as it passed. Inside the car, she said, she could see children's faces pressed against the glass, watching the fire. She recognized some of them as the Sodder children. Another woman, who ran a hotel in Charleston, reported that a group of children matching the descriptions of the missing 5 had stayed at her establishment in the days after the fire. She said they were accompanied by 2 adults she didn't recognize, and that the children were unusually quiet and did not speak to the hotel staff. When the Sodders were told about this sighting and contacted the hotel, the children were gone, and the trail went cold. Authorities followed up on neither account with any serious urgency. As the months passed without answers, George and Jenny refused to accept the official conclusion that their children were dead. They printed thousands of flyers with the children's photographs and distributed them across the state. They contacted the FBI, whose director, J. Edgar Hoover, wrote back personally to say the matter appeared to be local in nature and outside federal jurisdiction. They hired investigator after investigator, following lead after lead, each one dissolving into nothing. In 1952, convinced that their children might still be alive somewhere and that someone might recognize them, they erected a large billboard along Route 16 near the site of the house. It displayed the photographs of all 5 children, their names and ages, and a question printed beneath the images that read, "Kidnapped, murdered, or are they still alive?" The billboard stood there for nearly 4 decades, staring at every passing car, in every season, year after year, while George and Jenny waited for an answer that never came. And then, in 1968, 23 years after the fire, something arrived in the mail that changed everything all over again. Jenny was at home when she opened an envelope with no return address, postmarked from somewhere in Kentucky. Inside was a photograph. It showed a young man in his mid-20s, dark-haired, with features that Jenny recognized immediately. She was convinced she was looking at her son Louis, who had been 9 years old on the night of the fire, and would have been 32 by 1968. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, in careful handwriting, "Louis Sodder. I love brother Frankie. Illil boys. A901 32 or 35. Nobody in the family could explain what the message meant. The numbers meant nothing to anyone. The phrase "Illil boys" meant nothing. But the photograph itself was enough to convince Jenny that at least one of her children was still alive somewhere, and that someone, for reasons nobody could determine, had decided, after 23 years, to let her know. The family immediately hired another private investigator and sent him to Kentucky to follow whatever trail he could find. He took the photograph, took the family's money, and was never heard from again. He simply vanished. The trail, like every trail before it, went cold. George Sodder died in 1968, the same year the photograph arrived, without ever finding out what happened to his children. Jenny continued searching for the rest of her life. The Sodders never rebuilt the house. Instead, they converted the land where it had stood into a small memorial garden for the 5 children. The billboard on Route 16 stood until 1989, when Jenny Sodder died at the age of 85, still without an answer. She had spent 44 years looking. In 2011, the site was excavated one final time by investigators, hoping that modern forensic technology might find something the original searches had missed. They found a small section of vertebrae buried about a foot below the surface. DNA testing was inconclusive. It could not confirm whether the remains belonged to any of the Sodder children, and it could not rule it out either. The state of West Virginia officially recorded the deaths of all 5 children on December 30th, 1945, 5 days after the fire. The cause of death listed on each certificate was suffocation. No bodies were ever produced. No arrests were ever made. No explanation was ever given for the cut phone line, the missing ladder, the beef liver buried in the rubble, or the photograph mailed from Kentucky 23 years later. The last surviving Sodder child died in 2021, taking with her whatever remained of the family's hope that the truth would eventually surface. 5 children went to bed on Christmas Eve in 1945 and were never seen again. And to this day, nobody knows why. If this story stayed with you, subscribe to the Mystery Loop for more true stories that history never fully resolved. Hit the like button and let us know in the comments, what do you think really happened to the Sodder children? Thanks for watching, and we will see you in the next one.